Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is a groundbreaking series that dives into the lives of people living in the last frontier. Each episode introduces you to colorful characters from around the state. Funding for Indie Alaska is provided in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. Catch the latest episodes at alaskapublic.org.
The National Weather Service.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller with your Alaska weather this evening. Tonight is Wednesday, November 25th, the day before Thanksgiving, and you can keep up to date with us at arh.noaa.gov for all of the Alaska region websites. Our weather info line is 1-800-472-0391. And then you can find us on social media, on Facebook, NWS Alaska. You can find us on Twitter at NWS Alaska. Use the hashtag AKwx to keep up to date with all that's going on across the state. And then this show and a few other weather segments can be found later on this evening on YouTube using AKwx TV for your search. So let's jump in as we have plenty to talk about tonight with a pretty active watch and warning advisory map. You can see here, mainly due to all that moisture streaming up from the Gulf of Alaska into central portions of the state and the interior portions, we do have plenty of winter weather to talk about. So winter weather advisories, this is mainly from Talkeetna northward, expecting anywhere between 3 and 8 inches of additional accumulation of snow tonight, and this will last until about 5 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thanksgiving morning. And then as you get towards the Alaska range, that's where we're expecting the heavier snow amounts. Colder air still in place up here, and so heavier snow amounts expected up there. These are winter storm warnings for heavy snow. We could also see some freezing rain mix in there with the cold air trapped at the surface and some of the warmer air coming off of the ocean from down south, and so thus we get a little bit of a warm layer and could see some freezing rain at times in some of those colder valleys. Otherwise, we have advisories for the Fairbanks and the Fort Yukon area, and again, most of these out until tomorrow evening. Take a look at your local forecast office for the latest information on exactly how many inches of snow and what time those expire. As we look out towards the west coast, we do still have the remnants of a few coastal impacts with some high surf advisories. Those are also out until tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Thursday morning, and again, that's mainly for the Seward Peninsula and up towards Point Hope. So tonight for the Anchorage area and for much of south central Alaska, we're expecting heavy rain in advance of our Turkey Day here. We can see heavy rain for south central and mainly for Anchorage. These numbers are correlated to about a ½ inch to 1 inch of rain tonight. Pretty heavy along the coastal areas, and some of that is going to make it inland. So we're expecting some ponding on the roadways as a factor from that, as a result from that. No flooding really expected at this time, but with all the snow melt and the saturated ground that we've seen from the past couple days of these warmer temperatures, we do expect some ponding. And then the snow will continue for the higher elevations, mainly up into the Copper River Basin and west of the Parks Highway there north of Talkeetna. We saw those advisories posted, and up near Paxson in the Copper River Basin. So let's take a look at our satellite image tonight, and this will kind of help us to tell the story. Just off the screen here, we'll get into this, is where the moisture is coming into much of the state. But this out over the Aleutians is going to be an impact for the marine areas and for much of the west and central Aleutians. Storm force low here, working its way from west to east pretty slowly, but continuing an eastward track, just starting to approach Dutch Harbor. And with that, we do see some storm force winds on the backside of this, where the cold air is funneling down. And we'll see that as we get into some of our aviation charts, some of the turbulence associated with that. But this low is down to about 966 millibars. Then as we look out towards the mainland and to much of the Gulf of Alaska, we can see this plume of moisture Pretty cold cloud tops high up in the atmosphere here, making these nice and bright. That warm air helping to rise up into the atmosphere. And with that, that's where we're seeing all that heavy rain that we expect later tonight to develop over much of South Central, and those advisories and warnings that we have for the interior portions of the state. So let's take a look at that one more time. Here's our area of storm force low out to the west, and then our moisture streaming in from the North Pacific and the Gulf of Alaska. Just some lingering snow showers associated with a weakening low system up near Kotzebue. So looking at tonight's weather, or excuse me, today's weather, this afternoon, the darkness is playing tricks on me as well. 991 millibar low pressure system just south of Kodiak, and that is what's helping to lift all that moisture through South Central Alaska. We do expect, while there has been a small break this afternoon and this evening, we do expect this area of warmer air to make its way inland tonight and help to re-intensify the precipitation that we've already been seeing. Again, that is changing over to a rain-snow mix, possible pockets of freezing rain in there, and then becoming all snow. Some of the snow has been reported heavy at times north of Talkeetna near Broad Pass and Chulitna. So be advised if you're traveling the Parks Highway that there could be some very low visibility and quick accumulations through those areas of the snowfall. Then as we get out towards the western Aleutians, you see our area of low pressure at 966 millibars. This will start to weaken as it slides east, but nonetheless we do have much of the rainfall over the central Aleutians, and then as you get towards the western portion of the system, we do see some colder air wrapping down the backside. Up towards the northern portion of the state, a 1,000 millibar low pressure system. Not a huge impact, but there are some pockets of blowing snow just near the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue area, and again some lingering snow showers for areas up there as some of this moisture does make it all the way to the Brooks Range. Out over southeast Alaska, relatively quiet conditions compared to much of the rest of the state. You did have some high clouds, mid and high clouds pass through earlier, but those should be continuing on to the east. As we get into tonight, again, fairly quiet for southeast Alaska. We do start to see some of that light rain slide over your area. The real story will be the moderate to heavy rain that will make it into the southern portion of Alaska, mainly along the Gulf Coast. But again, we do expect much of the downsloping that has been keeping the Cook Inlet region dry should start to wane tonight, and thus we expect more precipitation to make it inland. Again, changing over to a rain-snow mix and then all snow as you get up towards the Alaska Range, keeping those warnings and advisories in place up there. Snow showers again for much of the Brooks Range, and then the snow starts to move off into the Bering Sea and to the Chukchi Sea as we see this area of low pressure begin to weaken. Our area of low pressure near the western Aleutians continues to slide eastward and bring those storm force winds to the east as it makes its way. Here we are now into Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. Our area of low pressure continues to weaken down to 970 millibars now. Slight orientation shift of the colder air now working its way a little bit more to the north of the system. So we see that rain-snow line now north of the system and then starting to change over to snow as you get into the central Bering. We do expect fairly widespread snow showers on the backside of this, with the Bering Sea being fairly warm still at this time. Our area of low pressure is now slid further to the north and at 994 millibars tomorrow. Do expect, again, continued precipitation through much of South Central, and some of that colder air will start to work its way back into Bristol Bay, helping things to mix to a rain-snow combination out there. And again, lingering snow showers off the northwest coast, but expect those to dwindle. And then we do have some light rain just skirting into southeast Alaska for tomorrow. Then on Friday, we expect that rain to continue to make its way eastward. This area of low pressure is now finally all the way to the eastern Aleutians and towards the Akpen, and with that widespread precipitation, some of it will remain moderate over the coastal regions, and we'll see precipitation continue for much of south central Alaska. So a very wet end of the week in store for us here for the holiday weekend. Colder air helping to change things over to a rain-snow mix out over southwest, and then we'll keep some snow in the forecast just north of the Fairbanks area. Taking a look at our temperatures now, we can see for much of southeast Alaska today, with those mostly dry conditions, we were only able to climb up into the mid-30s. Fairly light flow allowed it to be 36 degrees, and then upper 20s as you get a little bit farther inland. 38 degrees up near Yakutat. 40 degrees was the 4 o'clock temperature at Cordova, with 45 at Middleton. 38 degrees here up at Gulkana. And then as we work our way towards the west, we can see those continued very mild temperatures, 36 degrees with rain reported at Talkeetna as of 4 p.m. and 45 degrees down at Kodiak. As we look up towards the interior portion of the state, again, fairly warm conditions making their way all the way up to the Arctic coastline, 18 degrees even up at the Arctic coast at Barrow there. And as we work our way towards the Seward Peninsula, some colder temperatures there in the upper teens, but Nothing overly impressive for this time of year. Mid-30s to low 20s across the central portions of the state. And as we look out towards southwest Alaska, much of the area out there with that southerly flow climbed into the low 30s as well, kept it to 20 degrees at Bethel. And then as we work out over the Aleutians, over the Alaska Peninsula out into the Aleutians, 38 degrees at Dutch Harbor with 33 degrees at St. Paul, not Sandpoint. For tonight's low temperatures, expect fairly cool conditions. The coldest spots in the state, or at least the southern half of the state, will be over much of southeast Alaska with upper 20s and low 30s. For south central, continued mild overnight lows of just the low to mid 30s. Over the northern portion of the state, that's where we expect north of the Alaska Range, the colder temperatures to remain confined to the single digits, getting up to about 10 degrees near Nome, or excuse me, down to 10 degrees near Nome. And then over southwest Alaska, we'll see just above 10 degrees and out towards the Aleutian chain, anywhere from the low to mid 30s. Taking a look at high temperatures for tomorrow, not a whole lot of change expected. Continued warm air moving into southeast Alaska, so anywhere from the upper 30s to mid 40s for those areas. For south central, we'll hit near 40 degrees once again with onshore flow. Up towards the interior portion of the state, slightly cooler as that onshore flow starts to work its way a little bit more towards Eagle, Alaska, and that'll help with the colder air to start to bleed back down. So we'll see highs in the single digits to the lower teens. Southwest Alaska experiencing mid-teens, and out over the Aleutians, we expect highs in the mid-30s to low 40s. Now let's look at our flying weather. We have MVFR conditions expected across a wide portion of the mainland with that onshore flow. The worst conditions, the IFR pockets, are going to be where this moist flow begins to interact with terrain, especially along the Alaska Range and along portions of the higher mountains of south central Alaska. As we get up towards the Brooks Range, there's another pocket of IFR conditions, and as we see strong southerly flow making its way into the Alaska Peninsula, that's where we also expect some IFR conditions. So not a great flying day for much of the area. Let's take a look at our passes. Anaktuvik will be MVFR through much of the day. Adigan starting out MVFR, becoming IFR. Lake Clark and Merrill will both be instrument flight rules. Rainy will be the same. Windy, also instrument flight rules. And expecting Isabel to be mostly MVFR, but expect IFR conditions on the northern entrance, just like we saw today. Mentasta will be MVFR, becoming IFR through the day with onshore flow. And Tanita will be IFR to start out and should be improving later in the day to MVFR. Portage, IFR, becoming MVFR, again, very late in the day, probably not until the dark overnight hours. And Chilkoot and White will remain MVFR through much of the day tomorrow. So now looking at our freezing levels again, very high freezing levels for late November, 10,000 feet over the Gulf of Alaska, and that is extending all the way through much of south central, and we even see all of that push all of warm air all the way up into northwest Canada. As we look out towards the Aleutians, warmer air on the eastern side of that system at about 4,000 foot freezing levels, but then slightly cooler conditions wrapping down on the backside with the surface line starting just to clip the western Aleutians. As we look at tomorrow's icing, we do expect a small pocket of light to isolated moderate below 6,000 over much of the interior, below about 14,000 with that warmer air and that moisture surging into southeast Alaska right along the Alcan border, and then below about 15,000 feet here, mainly associated with that area of low pressure, starting to drop a little bit lower as you get towards the western side of that low. Looking at the jet stream now, very complicated jet stream with a very active pattern. We have multiple jets that are linking up and joining their energy together, which is making for very active pattern across all of Alaska. 65 knots becoming 100 knots as you get into northern Canada. This is our largest portion of the jet, 150 knots, our most continuous portion, down to 140 knots, and then up into the state at 95 knots. And then this 95 knots becoming 120 right there along the Alcan border, 130 over this ridge, and this is what's really helping to keep this pattern in place with the strong southerly onshore flow. So looking at our 9,000 foot winds now, again, we see our pockets of the strongest flow right along those jet accesses aloft, about 50 knots here going into, from the south to the north, going into southeast Alaska, and then again on the backside of this area of low pressure, 50 knots becoming 60 knots out of the north with those storm force winds. Similar story at 3,000 feet, just slightly lower winds, 40 knots, 50 knots in the Gulf of Alaska out of the south, and becoming northeast and then eventually more easterly to northerly, 50 knots on the backside of this area of low pressure. For tomorrow's turbulence charts, you can expect below 4,000, light to isolated moderate, and then below 12,000 as you get more into the terrain where we see these winds interacting with the mountains. Below 5,000, light to isolated moderate. And then our biggest area of concern for turbulence will be where those storm force northerly winds interact with the terrain below about 5,000 feet, occasional, widespread, moderate. Please stay with us. We'll be right back with your marine forecast.
By inserting a tube into the snowpack, hydrologists obtain a sample of the entire depth of the snow cover, which they weigh to determine how much water is in it. This method only tells the snow-water equivalent for a tiny area. To measure a large area, hydrologists sometimes use a low-flying aircraft. A special sensor on the aircraft measures natural radiation emitted from soils. This harmless radiation is blocked by water in the snow. The more water contained in a snowpack, the less radiation gets through the snow. So by measuring how much radiation is blocked, hydrologists can determine the amount of water in the snow below the aircraft flight line. Once hydrologists know how much water is contained in the snow, they can more accurately predict how much water or runoff to expect when the snow melts. Hydrologists usually think of runoff as the rainwater or snowmelt that doesn't soak into the ground or return to the air through the process of evaporation. It's just waiting for a place to go. Runoff can occur on all types of surfaces: roads, roofs of houses and buildings, sidewalks, and on surfaces that are covered with vegetation. Runoff can travel along the surface of the ground, eventually finding its way into street gutters, small streams, creeks, and finally into rivers, which make their way to the oceans. Because runoff collects water from widespread areas, small amounts of rainfall, say 1 inch, can cause a river to rise many feet and sometimes flood. It is therefore important for hydrologists to study runoff and be able to forecast the types of situations where it would be a problem.
Flood prediction depends critically on our ability to estimate runoff. The amount of runoff that can occur depends on many factors. If there's a big rain, the soil will soak up as much water as it can. Any more rain falling onto this wet soil becomes runoff. Some kinds of soil can soak up more water than others.
The speed at which water moves also determines the amount of runoff. Water moves faster over surfaces such as paved streets and gutters, and slower over rough, porous areas such as lawns and other areas covered by vegetation. Also, runoff travels faster over steep slopes than over flatter areas. Rivers convey runoff to the ocean. When the volume of water exceeds the river channel's capacity to contain it, flooding occurs. The role of the hydrologist goes beyond scientific measurements, data gathering, and predicting river floods. Since hydrologic forecasts are vital to those at risk, they must be communicated.
Hydrologists work with TV and radio stations, emergency managers, and city officials to determine how to better understand and utilize hydrologic information and then communicate it to the public.
The National Weather Service communicates forecasted river levels nationwide, 24 hours a day.
National Weather Service
Timely warnings inform the public when and in what areas rivers will flood and how to avoid being caught in one. These advance warnings have saved lives and property time and time again.
Very often, what we'll do is contact a severe weather forecaster, actually at the National Weather Service office, and say, what's happening? A good many of the decisions that we in emergency management make are going to be based on what we hear from the weather forecaster.
Whatever part of the county the Weather Service tells us that the problem's going to be at with the flooding on there, or a lot of rain, or the hailstorms, that's the part of the county that we're going to put our deputies at to be able to help out the citizens.
We're not just in front of a computer anymore. We become communicators. We work with the police departments, the sheriff's departments, fire departments, and emergency managers. We become their technical resource through interactions with the National Weather Service on what they can anticipate, where they can expect the worst problems to be.
So that they can have one step up on the weather that's coming in that day.
So the hydrologist's role is crucial in letting me make the decisions to know how far we're going to have to evacuate, how much do we notify people. And the really interesting thing about the hydrologist is they give us accurate information. People don't want to get a warning that's inaccurate, because pretty soon you're crying wolf. So the hydrologist in emergency management is crucial.
Hydrologists are scientific specialists. Their forecasts are glimpses into the future, granting us precious time to prepare for emergencies, saving lives and property. Hydrologists prepare us for the effects of floods. Their forecasts are also relied upon to meet the needs of cities, small towns, industries, and others that depend on adequate supplies of water. Dynamic and evolving, the science of hydrology moves forward. Ongoing discoveries and technological breakthroughs raise new challenges, opportunities for the hydrologists of tomorrow. If you're interested in a career that saves lives, solves serious problems, and advances the frontiers of science, pursue the study of hydrology. What can you do now to become a hydrologist? If you're studying science, mathematics, and computers, you're already on your way. Go to college and take advanced studies in these subjects, as well as hydrological science. Read more about hydrology. You can start by visiting this website.
Welcome back to the show. You wouldn't think that a spring flood breakup segment would be fitting in late November, but obviously that was, since we are raining on a wet and saturated snowpack right now. As you can see from our sea ice edge from yesterday, it has grown a little bit here in the Bering Strait, and thus we've separated the Chukchi Sea from the Bering Sea with some marginal sea ice there. South of Nunivak Island, we have seen with these warm temperatures and strong winds, we have seen some ice break up in these regions. It also has been present north of Nunivak, but the more predominant breakup has been south of Nunivak Island. So be aware if you have intentions of interacting with the ice out there that there are chunks that are starting to break up from each other. Looking out over Thursday's marine forecast for southeast Alaska, we see mainly southeast flow, 20 anywhere up to 35 knots as you get towards the northeastern portion of the Gulf of Alaska. Gale force winds up there. And generally for the inner passageways, seas will be between 4 and 5 feet. Out over the open waters, expect between 12 all the way up to 20 feet in the northeastern portion. Really cranking things up now on Friday at southeast Alaska. We expect southeast winds 40 all the way up to 50 knots, storm force winds, and seas 16 to 21 feet out over the open waters. A little bit calmer for the inner passageways, 25 to 30 knots out of the south-southeast, and seas between 5 and 6 feet. Out over south central, we'll see a similar trend there. Strong southerly winds to southeast winds as you get towards Prince William Sound, anywhere between 25 and 40 knots. We'll expect seas on the order of 10 feet as you get towards the protected areas, but out over the open waters, 18 to 25 feet. And then out over the Cook Inlet and towns towards Shelikof, northeast to southwest winds anywhere between 20 and 30 knots, and seas about 5 to 7 feet. Now on Friday, we expect conditions to slowly improve for south central Alaska, south central waters, anywhere between 30 and 35 knots out of the south-southeast out over the open waters, and 7-foot seas for Prince William Sound, while we keep things about 15 feet for much of the open waters. And then becoming easterly and southeasterly for much of the protected areas there, west of the Barrens, 20 to 25 knots, seas about 5 feet. Out over the Alaska Peninsula, expect south to southeast winds south of the peninsula, and then becoming east north of the peninsula, 20 to 40 knots there, and seas are going to be on the order of about 3 to 6 feet north of the peninsula and 13 to 16 feet to the south. Then on Friday, we expect conditions a little bit more variable southeast to northeast, 20 knots and 3 to 6 feet north of the peninsula, 20 to 30 knots out of the south, and 21-foot seas down there. As we look out towards the Aleutians, expect winds to rotate around that area of low pressure, so southeast becoming northeast and eventually northwest. Storm force winds and 22-foot seas will be our worst conditions that we expect, 24-foot seas, our worst conditions there for the central and western Aleutians. And then on Friday, as that system passes off to the east, expect everything to become northwesterly, 25 to 40 knots, 45 knots here near Dutch Harbor, and expect seas on the order of 14 to 22 feet. Out over the west coast, mainly east to northeast flow, 25 to 40 knots, and seas fairly low here for the central portions, but climbing up to 14 feet near the Pribilof Islands. And then on Friday, expect northeast becoming northwest winds near the Pribs, 25 to 40 knots, and again, seas between about 6 and 12 feet. Now over the Arctic coast, expect winds a little bit more variable, southwest becoming north out over the near the Seward Peninsula, and heavy freezing spray also forecasted for those areas. Seas are going to be about 7 feet, and then along the ice pack, expect west to southwest winds at about 15 knots. And wrapping up the marine forecast along the Arctic coast for Friday, north to northeast winds, 15 all the way up to 40 knots here north of Shishmaref, and seas generally between 8 and 10 feet with more freezing spray in the forecast. So let's recap briefly. Tonight we're looking for onshore flow, bringing more moisture. Some of it will be heavy rain at times for the coastal regions, and keeping those winter weather advisories and warnings out for much of the central portions where the colder air is still trapped. Strong area of low pressure bringing storm force winds to mariners out over the Aleutians. That onshore flow continues on into Thursday, keeping it wet for Thanksgiving while it's dry for much of southeast Alaska. And then as we get into Friday, expect that area of low pressure to work its way east. Combined with that moisture, will keep things very wet for much of southeast to south central Alaska. Thanks for joining us this evening, and have a great Thanksgiving.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.